Hello, Year 3, and welcome to today's literacy lesson. So we are carrying on from yesterday, just like we are doing throughout the week, to complete our amazing Professor Pete's story. Now, you sent in your literacy work yesterday, which was really, really great. You've written the start of your story, and today we are going to go on to write the problem section of our story. So what is the problem in our Professor Pete story? We're going to go on to write that into our own stories. So we're going to write the problem section of our story and making sure we're including our VCOP success criteria that we included yesterday. And we are going to still have a try and have a go at our setting and character description throughout. So when we meet our new character in the underground station, we're going to try and describe them, and we're going to describe what it looks like when we go down those steps into the underground station. So we're still including our setting and character descriptions. I've put a little star by adverbs because we would love it if you could try and include some adverbs in your work. I saw so many adverbs yesterday, like quickly, slowly, excitedly, cautiously, so many. So if you continue to use those today, we will be so impressed. So before we go on to look at our Professor Pete story of today, I would like to share some amazing examples of yesterday's work that we saw, because they deserve it and they deserve to have their amazing work shown. And also, you get to magpie some of these ideas. If you hear something in these pieces of work that you really, really love, you can write it down, or you can pause the video and write it down so you can add that to your story. So this is Sophie's from 3H. She wrote so much and it was so fantastic. Now, we don't expect you to write this much, but if you want to, that's really, really great. But don't be put off by how much writing is here, because we don't expect so much writing. Even a couple of sentences for a paragraph would suffice, wouldn't it? So Sophie has written, crash, bang, boom. The astonishing metallic time machine landed on the ground with an almighty thud. Cautiously, Professor Pete opened his sturdy iron door before stepping out onto the street. Stepping out onto the street, Professor Pete looked around in amazement, and he couldn't believe his tired blue eyes. In his surroundings, he could smell the thick grey smoke. If you breathe it in, you will die. Underneath the smoke, there were piles and piles of burnt, demolished debris that was originally someone's house. Sorry, I had to pause that. Originally somebody's house. All over the city, Pete could hear people shouting, babies crying, and the sound of shovels scraping on the bumpy, narrow path. In the blink of an eye, after a nervous gulp, Pete heard an ear-splitting, blood-curdling siren before he suddenly said to himself, is that an air raid siren? Am I in World War II? Out of nowhere, Pete heard a booming voice from behind him. It said, what are you doing out in the open? Should you be in the shelters? Are you such an idiot? Go now! Suddenly, Pete turned around and saw a man in a black long coat that was also wearing a domed metal helmet. While the man was talking to Pete was thinking whether he should listen or go back to the future. All of a sudden, Pete decided to listen and do as he was told, so he ran to some stone-hard steps he had spotted earlier. Wow, Sophie, you have done so well, and I hope the rest of Year 3 agree with me. You have included some amazing adjectives. You've described the setting very, very well. You told me what you can smell. You told me what you can see. And you have included so much in this. You've even included your inverted commas in your speech, and you included lots of really great speech here. You've really, really told a really good story, and I can really picture what's going on. So well done for that. The next one is Danny from my class. So Danny has done really well with his writing. He has written, crash, with an almighty thud, the amazing silver time machine landed somewhere. Carefully, Professor Grump slowly opened the door. Above his lips, he had a curly, long moustache, as well as grey, thick hair. He's used my favourite conjunction there. Well done, Danny. He's wearing a green tweed jacket. As he walked out of the time machine, he felt crunching rubble on his dark black boots. He could smell thick grey smoke that was up his pointy nose. He could see black exploding bombs burning red fire, burnt out buildings, thick grey smoke, and thick grey smoke. He could hear an air raid siren. In front of him, there was a deep, demanding voice that said, "What are you doing out in the open? Didn't you hear the siren?" said a tall, thin man, dressed with a long black coat and a domed metal helmet. "Go in the shelter now." "Okay, I'll go." Then he said, doing as he said, he quickly ran down the concrete steps. Fantastic. What a great start to your story, Danny. You have included your setting description, your character description, and you have remembered to include your VCOP. I can tell you have tried very, very hard with that. So well done. And finally, for 3K, we have Pacey. So Pacey has written, "Boom, the amazing golden time machine landed with an almighty thud. Professor Pete's time machine had landed. He was wearing a red woolly scarf, as well as, oh, well done, Pacey, you've used as well, a brown fabric coat. On his feet, he had 2 black shiny boots. Carefully, he pulled the golden shiny door open and he stepped out onto the open road and he wondered where he had landed this time. Professor Pete looked up in the air and he saw some grey thick smoke. Suddenly, he heard the air raid siren. It was so loud that was the only thing he heard. It made his ears ring as well. Then he heard a booming voice from behind him. He said, "What are you doing out in the open? Get in the shelter now." So Professor Pete thought that he should. All he could see was sad faces, people crying. Then he saw some stone bumpy steps. So he went down them. Absolutely brilliant, Pacey. You've done exactly the same thing. You have described your professor very, very well. You've said what you can see. You've even put a question in. He wondered, where has he landed this time? Suddenly. And you've used some exclamation marks in this as well. What you 3 have done really well is you have followed the structure of our Professor Pete story and changed some bits to match what ideas you have come up with, which is exactly what we wanted you to do. And you have stopped where you were meant to stop and you have done really well. So well done. So the rest of year 3, if you spot any ideas you really, really like, you can pause the video or go back to them later on and you can magnify them, can't you? So we are going on to our next part of the story today. And this part of the story is the problem section. So what happens when he goes down those stone bumpy steps? So quickly he ran with speed down some steps which led to the underground trains. Professor Pete realised he must be in London in World War II, in the middle of an air raid. Suspense filled the atmosphere. Huddled groups, babies crying, and worried-looking faces surrounded him. Under a bench crouched a small, frightened boy with an old, battered suitcase. Nobody seemed to have noticed him, so Professor Pete knelt down to check if he was all right. "What are you doing under there?" he asked kindly. "I was on my way to the train to be evacuated when I heard the air raid siren," said the little boy. "So I ran down the steps, but then I couldn't see my mum anymore." Professor Pete helped the boy to his feet. He noticed he was wearing a large brown label with his name on. Quickly they searched the underground, but there was no sign of the boy's mother. In the end, they decided they would just have to set off and hope they saw his mum on the way. So that is what we are writing about today, year 3. We aren't going to write the end of the story. We're going to stop just before they actually find the boy's mum. So looking at your story maps then, hopefully you have your story maps in front of you. If you don't have your story maps, pause the video so you can go and grab your story map. But this is my story, this section of my story map today. So at the start of the story map, I can see that I need to talk about Professor Pete going down the steps. And then he arrives into his underground station, doesn't he? I've got a picture there of people waiting around. There's a lot of people finding shelter. whilst the air raid siren is going off up in the open air. And I've got this underground setting just to remind me that it was in the underground to help with my quick description that I'm going to include into my writing. Down here, I've got a character. Now I've tried to find a character, an evacuee little boy that I think I can describe in my writing. I can see that he's got a brown tag around his neck, which will have his name on. So I put that in there so I know that after I've described coming down into the underground, I find the little boy. And then I've got a picture of a professor searching, because after that, for mine is Professor Percy. Professor Percy and the little boy go and try and find his mother before he has to get onto the train. So that is what I'm going to use today to structure my writing. Now, I wrote a little bit of writing before I started this lesson, so we can go through that and see if I have included the right things today. Okay, so today I don't really want us to focus so much on the VCOP. We're going to still have a look at that. We want to see if I've followed my story map. So I've written, in a hurry, Professor Percy dashed down the steps which led to an underground train station. Across the platform were huddled crying children, worried parents, and women hugging their crying babies. Under a bench hid a small frightened boy who was sat on top of a worn square suitcase. With a concerned look on his face, Professor Percy crouched down to check on him. "What are you doing under there?" he asked kindly. Looking up, Professor Percy could see his tear-stained face fill with hope. "Can you help me find my mum?" he mumbled. "I ran down here when I heard the air raid siren, but I lost her." Professor Percy helped the boy to his feet before turning the large brown label hanging from his neck. "Let's go and search for her." Quickly, they searched the underground, but there was no sign of the boy's mother. Okay, have I written about Professor Percy going down the steps? I have, and he gets to the underground. Okay, so I've written about him going to the underground. What can he see? A little bit of a second description here. I spoke about seeing the huddled crying children and there's crying babies, and that he could see a small frightened boy, which is the start of our introduction to the character. Now, I haven't described the character too much, have I? I've just said that he was small and frightened, and that he had a worn square suitcase, and down here I've mentioned that he had a label hanging around his neck. So that helps the reader visualize what this little boy might look like and how he is feeling. Then I've gone on to search, don't I, that he helped the boy up, and they searched for his mother, but they could not find him. Okay, so what I want you to do now, so knowing that I've followed the right structure and I've used some of the ideas from our Professor Pete story I read a few minutes ago, but also included some of my own ideas, haven't I? So I want you to pause this video and see if you can spot any VCOP. What pieces of punctuation have I used? What openers have I used? Have I used any double adjectives? Have I used any conjunctions? We're getting really good at this now, aren't we? So pause the video now and see if you can spot any on this screen. Okay, then, well, let's start with our double adjectives. What piece of punctuation needs to go in between our double adjectives? A comma. We do need to remember our commas, don't we? Huddled crying. I have described the children there, haven't I? Are there any others? Small frightened boy. So to help us visualize what the boy is like, I've said that he's small and frightened. Straight away, we know how that boy is feeling, don't we? Worn square, to help visualize what that suitcase looks like that he found before. Large brown. So I've described what the label looks like that's hanging around his neck. Okay, our openers then. Can you remember our 3 different types of openers? We've got our adverb openers, haven't we? Which is what I've starred today, because I'd love you to add an adverb opener. I don't know if I've actually, I have included an adverb opener. We've got our position openers, tell us where something is. and our time openers to tell us when something happens. So we have got in a hurry. How did Professor Pete run down those steps? He ran in a hurry across the platform. That's telling us where those children and those parents and those crying babies are across the platform. Under a bench, again, telling me where that boy was. He wasn't just sat in the middle of the platform. He was hid under a bench with a concerned look on his face. So Professor Percy crouched down, and I'm telling you how his face looked as he did that. He looked very concerned because that boy looked very frightened. Looking up, so Professor Percy, so when a little boy looked up, Professor Percy could see his face. So I'm telling you what that little boy is doing, aren't I? And then there's my adverb opener, quickly. I've told you how he searched the underground quickly. They were under time, they had to do it very, very quickly before the boy had to get onto the train to be evacuated. So he wanted to see his mum say goodbye, didn't he? But they didn't have any time to spare. They had to do it quickly, which is why I chose to use the adverb. Some conjunctions I've used then, I've got which, who, when, but, and another but. So I've tried to vary them as much as possible, not using the same ones. Which, who, when, but. Okay then, so I also want you now, hopefully you've already discussed it, but if you need to discuss it a little bit more, you can pause it here. What pieces of punctuation can you see in this? Okay then, so Professor Percy, it has a capital letter. Professor Percy is the name of my character, isn't it? So Professor Percy needs a capital letter. So every time I have included Professor Percy, I have written it with capital letters. Okay. I have got my commas between my double adjectives, which we've discussed, and I've got capital letters at the start of my sentences, haven't I? Where I put a full stop to end my sentence, I then start my next sentence with a capital letter. Over here, I put a question mark. Why have I put a question mark there? It's because the boy has asked a question, hasn't he? Can you help me find my mum? He's asking Professor Percy a question which requires a response. So I put a question mark in there. Brilliant. Why have I put inverted commas into this piece of writing then? I've put quite a few inverted commas. Why do I include inverted commas? What are they used for? Why do I need them? Exactly. Hopefully you told me that it tells me where there is speech. So, what are you doing under there? He asked kindly. So you put the inverted commas where something is said out loud. Okay. So he wouldn't say, "What are you doing under there?" he asked kindly. He wouldn't say he asked kindly out loud, would he? So that is why you need to end the add another inverted comma where the speech actually ends. So you need to know if you need to read it out loud to help you, then that's fine. What are you doing under there? Oh, I'm stopping speaking now. I need to put an inverted comma in there. Okay. Fantastic then. So now we've spotted our VCOP techniques and you have seen an example of my writing and I've read out the Professor Pete story. I want you to now go on to write your problem section of our story. Remember, look at your story map. What have you added to your story map up to the part where he's searching for his mum? What happened? What ideas can you put in there? What can you see? How did that little boy feel? What did Professor Pete do to help that little boy? That is what you are going to talk about today. And I want you to try and make sure we punctuate our sentence correctly, especially using our capital letters and our full stops. And wherever you can try and up-level your writing and adding double adjectives or openers and conjunctions, that is just making your work even better. Okay, so you've done really, really well so far, starting your story yesterday and then going on to do it today, and we will be finishing it tomorrow, okay? Don't feel pressured to have to send in a whole page of writing, okay? Because it will get you overwhelmed. We're not used to writing at home. It's really, really tricky, isn't it? Even if you try your best with a few sentences, that is what we would love to see, okay? So if you need to go back to what I've just done and go back through the lesson to help you, that is fine, but we are using our original story as a basis to help with our structure. But you can add in all the amazing ideas you've come up with in your own version, okay? So I look forward to reading these later, and I hope you have a great time writing them.